Imagine announcing your confidence, your ambition, and your love for life on your outfit. No, not because of your unique fashion sense, but because you wrote it on your clothes. In the 11th century in Córdoba, that's exactly what Wallada bint al-Mustakfi did. Who was Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, you ask? She was a poet in the 11th century and the subject of our discussion today. Welcome back to Sometimes and Forever. In today's episode, this is the fourth of a 5-part series that we're doing on women in literature, and we're going to talk about a woman who was rich, she was brilliant, scandalous, and absolutely uninterested in behaving. This was a poet who turned words into power and men into footnotes. Are you ready to dive into the world of another literary titan? You sure you're ready? Okay, let's do this. So let's go back to the 11th century. We're in Córdoba, and this is a Muslim city that was in the territory called al-Andalus. Córdoba was a city of libraries, luxury, poetry, and political chaos. The Umayyad Caliphate was crumbling at the time. Power was changing hands constantly. There were invasions, betrayals, poisoned rulers. Generally, people were doing what they seemed to like to do, which is fight for power. And yet, in the middle of all of that instability, culture was thriving. Poetry mattered. This says to me that this was a mature society, and this was a society that was at its pinnacle, so to speak, because the arts tend to thrive, it tends to flourish in societies that are grown. Anyway, standing right at the center of that world is a woman who absolutely refused to be quiet and to be a good Muslim woman, basically. Wallada was born around the year 1001, and when she was a young woman in her 20s, her father, Muhammad III, seized power. She ended up becoming the daughter of a caliph. Now, calling her father's rule successful would be stretching it, because it was not successful. Her father, Muhammad III, ruled Córdoba very briefly and very badly. He was known for his excesses, for his incompetence, his indulgences, and within just 18 months, he was overthrown. He ended up fleeing the city, but his enemies found him and they poisoned him. This is a lot of intrigue happening here. But here's the thing, because with the death of her father, this is where Wallada's story actually begins. When her father died, she inherited his wealth, and with that inheritance came something very rare for a woman of her time. Do you know what that was? Independence. Yes, her father's death gave her something very precious: her independence. Wallada didn't take her money and retreat into the quiet, respectable life that was expected of her. She didn't disappear behind a veil. In fact, she did the opposite. She went out into the public unveiled. It is reported that she wore sheer fabrics that scandalized Córdoba's religious establishment. I can imagine the religious leaders clutching their turbans every time Wallada came out in public. But in all seriousness, can you imagine that, really? A woman in the medieval Muslim world defying male rulers so openly? It's unheard of. And there wasn't much, it seems, that the men could do about it. To me, it's like Wallada was daring them to say something. She wanted them to just say one word, just one word. Because she knew that she was not afraid of them and she was not going to cower behind anything that they wanted her to cower behind. This shows also that she had a very strong mind. She was a very strong person. Now, Córdoba at the time prized intellectual and religious pluralism, and Wallada knew this. So she knew that there were certain rules that she could bend a little bit, and boy did she bend them. She also did something that was very daring, very different, because she embroidered her own poetry on her clothes. Now, I don't think she did this on every bit of garment that she had. Maybe she did it with just a few pieces, or maybe just one piece that she really liked. But it's reported that on one shoulder, she announced to the world that I am, by Allah, fit for high positions. Aren't we all, sister? Aren't we all? Sorry, I'm gonna read that for you again, but she said, I am by Allah fit for high positions, and I'm going by my way with pride. That's what's on one shoulder. And on the other shoulder she wrote, forsooth I allow my lover to kiss my cheek and bestow my kisses on him who craves it. This was not being subtle, was it? Wallada wasn't asking for permission to live her life. She was declaring herself. And I really like that. I really do. Now here's something she did that really set her apart from everybody else. Wallada opened her home as a mixed gender salon. It was a poetry salon. Don't get any ideas. It was a poetry salon. And this was something that was almost unheard of at the time. The salon was a place where poets gathered to read, debate, flirt, and yes, even compete with each other. Wallada mentored young writers, especially young women, and she became a literary force in Córdoba. Her salon was said to be impeccably proper, even if the poetry that was being read there wasn't absolutely impeccable, but that's another story. Now, among the poets that gathered at her salon was this young lady called bint al-Tiani. She was the daughter of a fig seller whose brilliance carried her from the market stalls into the most rarefied literary circle in Córdoba. Wallada is said to have favored the girl. She wrote Muja, love poetry, and the poetry that she wrote was so bold and so unguarded that the persons who came after they had died chose not to preserve some of these writings. What does survive is fragile, fragmented, and it's not the whole thing, but based on these bits and pieces, persons have been able to examine them, and some people have concluded that Wallada and Muja were actually lovers. I don't believe that, but there is no denying that these two women were very close. There seems to have been a falling out between them at some point in their relationship, because one of Muja's surviving poems is a very sharp accusation, and it's addressed directly to Wallada herself. In it, Muja condemns Wallada for being a promiscuous person and for bearing a child outside of marriage. This rupture between them that caused Muja to write this poem to Wallada, historians often use this to read into their relationship, and they use it as evidence that the two women were lovers. Some persons consider it like a lover's quarrel. Maybe it was a betrayal, a breaking of trust. Whatever it was, we know for certain that there was a breach in their relationship. And Wallada's most intimate relationships have been smoothed over the years. They have been censored and some of it erased. So like so much of her life, the truth that survives, it comes down in fragments, but we can still put it together and come to a very sensible conclusion of who she was and how she lived. Now here's something that's very interesting about Wallada. She had one great torrid love affair, and it is impossible to tell her story and not talk about her romance with Ibn Zaydun. Their affair took place not very long after she opened her salon, and this is when she met Ibn Zaydun, and they began a passionate and tumultuous love affair. Ibn Zaydun was brilliant, he was ambitious, devastatingly charming, and one of the most celebrated poets in Al-Andalus. When Wallada and Zaydun began their affair, it was a meeting of equals, two literary stars circling each other through verse. Interestingly though, most of what we know about Wallada actually comes from poems that Zaydun wrote about her. That's how powerful a hold she had over him. He describes her pale skin, her light hair, her blue eyes, but more importantly for our discussion today, he described her brilliant mind. Their courtship unfolded largely through poetry, and this is a good thing for us because we get to see what was going on between these two. Wallada wrote about going out at nights and traveling to see Ibn. This was a delicious reversal of convention because at that time it was expected that it was the man who was supposed to travel to see the woman. Women were really supposed to wait to be desired and to be pursued by men. But Wallada was different. We know this by now. She was a very different kind of person. And she acted on how she felt. So she was not going to wait around for Zaydun to come and visit her. She went to see him. Now here's the sad part of their romance, because their relationship was volatile. Zaydun was jealous. He was a jealous kind of person. He was controlling, and sometimes he was a very cruel man, because it is reported, and this is probably something that he has written about in his own poems, that he used to beat her. Yes, he used to beat her. He had affairs. He cheated on her. At one point, he went so far as to have an affair with one of Wallada's own slaves. I'm using that word slave because that's what the person was at the time, you know. This is just what the history is. So he had an affair with this person who seems to have been relatively close to Wallada. But here's the most cruel thing for me. For me, the most cruel thing that he did to her after the beating part, he publicly criticized her poetry. To me, that was just really awful and despicable. Why would he do that? Clearly, brilliance doesn't guarantee that a person is kind. Thankfully, Wallada did not stay silent. She responded the way that she knew best, with words that were sharp enough to draw blood. And after a while, she finally left him backside and she found a new man. She chose Abu Amir ibn Abdas. He was a powerful court minister. He was not especially charming like Zaydun was, and Abdas was no poet. But you know what? He was steady, and that's what Wallada needed. She lived with him for many, many years. Actually, she was with him for the rest of her life. They stayed together until he died, actually, and they never got married, but they didn't seem to have been bothered by the fact that they weren't married. Now, as you can imagine, Bad Mind Zaydun wasn't going to take this lying down. He was furious and he was humiliated. And he took up his pen and he began to write. This is what he did. He wrote a satirical letter pretending to be Wallada, using her voice to mock Abdas. He said in what he wrote that Abdas was stupid and ugly and foul-smelling, and he was pretending that it was Wallada who was writing this. How despicable a person is this? This writing spread like wildfire through Córdoba. But if you think Wallada was going to let this go quietly, well, you don't know her yet. She didn't. She unleashed a series of brutal poems attacking Zaydun. She called him an adulterer, a gigolo, a thief, and famously nicknaming him the Hexagon, because he had 6 sides and every one of them was terrible. This wasn't some petty revenge. This was a woman standing up for herself. Wallada's new man Abdas didn't like what Zaydun did either. And apparently, Zaydun was quite a character, because he was involved in a conspiracy to overthrow the ruler of Córdoba, and he wanted to install a new Umayyad. Wallada's lover, Abdas, as we said before, was a minister in the government, and he learned of this plot. And you know what he did? He had Zaydun thrown into prison, where he languished for 2 long years. I can't help but say it serves him right. He finally escaped from prison though, and he went to Seville in Spain, where he ended up starting over. He rebuilt his career, and of course he continued to write poems. But get this, most of the poems that he wrote, even after he left Córdoba and went over to Seville, they were poems about Wallada. Talk about not being able to let go. He was still writing about her many, many years after their relationship had ended. After the scandal with Ibn Zaydun, Wallada begins to slip from the historical record, not with a dramatic exit, but with a quiet persistence. Her salon, as far as we know, remained open, its doors still welcoming poets, thinkers, young women, and men hungry for language and possibilities. Wallada herself lived into her 90s. She wrote poetry until the end of her life. But only 8 of her poems survive. Most of what we know about her actually comes through the words of other people, and as I said before, Zaydun was one of those persons who wrote about her the most. So I find it so fascinating that even though even though they had such a bad relationship, he couldn't get over her. He kept writing about her, and a lot of her writings have not survived. His writings about her have survived, and still he ends up being almost like a footnote to her. So she still ends up being the more prominent of the two, even though it's his writings that have survived. Isn't that just fascinating? Anyway, through all of the gaps that may be there in her story, we're still able to put together a very clear picture of who she was. Wallada lived on her own terms. She loved openly and spoke boldly in a world that tried to forget her. And we know about her anyway. And that is why she belongs in this series, not just as a poet, but as a woman who understood the power of words and wielded them without apology. Wallada bint al-Mustakfi didn't ask history to make room for her. She simply lived and wrote as though life had already made room for her. Most of her poetry is gone. Her voice survives in fragments, in rumors, in the words of others, as I said before, of people who loved her and people who tried to use her. And yet, even in what is missing, her presence is unmistakable. She reminds us that women have always been there. We've always been there, even if the records about us are thin. Wallada didn't wait to be remembered. She declared herself. And maybe that's a quiet legacy that she leaves with us. That's a lesson that we can draw from her life. We don't need permission to matter and to be powerful. We just need to live. That's it. Just live. This has been Sometimes and Forever. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, remember that life is yours to live. Blessings.